In the early hours of January 3rd, 2026, U.S. President Donald Trump stated publicly that American forces had carried out direct military strikes inside Venezuela and had captured the country's sitting president, Nicolás Maduro, along with his wife, removing them from Venezuelan territory. The announcement was made by Trump himself on social media, marking an extraordinary escalation in a long-running confrontation between Washington and Caracas. Shortly after the statement, explosions were reported in Venezuela's capital, Caracas, and in several other regions of the country. Venezuelan authorities declared a national emergency, mobilized military units, and reported casualties among civilians and members of the armed forces, though no official figures were immediately released. Power outages were reported near key military installations, and state television broadcast appeals for unity and resistance. If the events unfold as described by U.S. officials, this would represent the most direct U.S. military intervention in Latin America since the 1989 invasion of Panama, when American forces captured military leader Manuel Noriega and removed him from power. That historical parallel, explicitly referenced by analysts and observers, underscores the gravity of the situation. The claim that Nicolás Maduro and his wife were captured did not originate from anonymous sources or unverified reports. It came directly from the President of the United States, who said the operation was carried out with the involvement of U.S. law enforcement and elite forces. Trump said additional details would be provided at a press conference later in the day. U.S. officials, cited by Reuters, said the operation was the culmination of months of pressure on the Maduro government over allegations of drug trafficking, corruption, and illegitimacy following disputed elections. Trump has repeatedly accused Maduro of presiding over what he described as a narco-state and of allowing drugs to flow into the United States, claims that the Venezuelan government has consistently denied. According to Trump, the operation was framed not as a conventional act of war, but as a law enforcement action tied to criminal charges. This distinction is likely to be central to the legal and political debate that now follows, both domestically and internationally. Venezuelan authorities immediately rejected Washington's account. Senior officials said the country had been attacked by foreign forces and accused the United States of violating Venezuela's sovereignty. They demanded proof of life for Nicolás Maduro and his wife and condemned what they described as an illegal intervention aimed at seizing control of Venezuela's natural resources, particularly its vast oil reserves. Defense officials in Caracas appeared on state television condemning the presence of foreign troops and calling on citizens to resist. The interior minister urged Venezuelans not to cooperate with what he called a terrorist enemy, while the vice president said she did not know the whereabouts of the president or the first lady. The contrasting narratives reflect a deep and long-standing divide. For years, relations between the United States and Venezuela have been defined by sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and mutual accusations. The U.S. has imposed sweeping financial and oil sanctions on Venezuela's government and state-owned oil company, PDVSA, citing democratic backsliding, human rights abuses, and corruption. Venezuela, in turn, has accused Washington of economic warfare and of attempting to destabilize the country to gain access to its resources. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world, a fact that has long shaped its geopolitical significance. For much of the 20th century, Venezuelan crude was a major supplier to U.S. refineries. That relationship deteriorated sharply in the early 2000s and collapsed further under Nicolás Maduro's presidency, as production fell and sanctions tightened. In recent months, pressure on Caracas intensified. The United States expanded sanctions enforcement to include shipping networks and tankers transporting Venezuelan oil. U.S. forces carried out dozens of strikes on vessels Washington alleged were involved in drug trafficking in the Caribbean and Pacific. Several tankers were seized or blocked, sharply reducing Venezuela's oil exports and cutting off a critical source of revenue for the government. At the same time, U.S. military assets were deployed to the region, including warships, advanced fighter jets, and an aircraft carrier stationed in the Caribbean. Trump openly discussed the possibility of a blockade of Venezuelan oil and repeatedly said it would be smart for Maduro to leave power. Just days before the strikes, Maduro had publicly signaled openness to dialogue with Washington, including allowing U.S. investment in Venezuela's oil sector. That overture, reported by Reuters earlier in the week, now appears overtaken by events. Witnesses in Caracas described a night of fear and confusion. Explosions lit up the sky for more than an hour. Aircraft were heard flying at different altitudes. Black smoke rose near military bases. Residents said they struggled to obtain reliable information beyond state television broadcasts. International reaction was swift. Venezuela's allies, including Russia, Iran, and Cuba, condemned the strikes as violations of national sovereignty and international law. Iran called on the United Nations Security Council to intervene to stop what it described as unlawful aggression. Other governments in Latin America expressed concern, warning that direct U.S. military action revives painful memories of past interventions in the region. Even governments that oppose Maduro politically have been cautious, aware that public support for U.S. intervention remains deeply unpopular across much of Latin America. Inside the United States, the operation raises immediate legal and political questions. Under the U.S. Constitution, Congress has the authority to declare war. Legal experts are already questioning under what legal framework the strikes were carried out, particularly given previous controversies surrounding U.S. attacks on suspected drug trafficking vessels that resulted in civilian deaths. Trump's decision also risks political backlash. While his administration has framed the action as necessary to combat drug trafficking and criminal activity, a significant segment of his political base favors an America First approach and has historically opposed foreign military interventions. Members of Congress from both parties are likely to demand briefings, oversight, and legal justification. Financial markets are closely monitoring developments. Energy analysts say oil prices could rise in the short term due to uncertainty and potential supply disruptions. At the same time, some analysts argue that if a new government emerges in Venezuela and sanctions are eventually lifted, increased oil production could weigh on prices in the medium term. The uncertainty highlights how closely global energy markets are tied to geopolitical risk. The situation inside Venezuela remains fluid. It is unclear who holds effective control of the government, how the armed forces will respond in the coming days, or whether a transitional authority will emerge. Opposition figures have so far refrained from making definitive statements, reflecting the uncertainty and volatility of the moment. The broader implications extend beyond Venezuela. If a major power can openly capture a sitting head of state and their spouse, citing law enforcement and counter-narcotics justifications, it raises fundamental questions about international norms, sovereignty, and the use of force. Other governments will be watching closely to see how the United States justifies its actions and how the international community responds. What happens next will depend on several factors: official briefings from Washington, responses from Congress, actions by the United Nations, reactions from regional governments, and developments on the ground in Venezuela. The next 48 to 72 hours are expected to be critical. For now, the facts remain stark. A U.S. president has publicly stated that American forces carried out direct military strikes in Venezuela and captured the country's president and first lady. Explosions have been reported. A national emergency has been declared. International condemnation has followed. Whether this moment becomes a contained episode or the beginning of a prolonged and destabilizing chapter in the Western Hemisphere will be determined in the days ahead. What is clear is that the announcement alone has already altered the trajectory of U.S.-Venezuela relations and set in motion consequences that will reach far beyond Caracas and Washington. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of one of the most consequential geopolitical developments of this decade.